Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to talk about my family's recent trip over to the UK. Now we will talk about things like games, for example, what handhelds I brought, what games I played, some tips and tricks when it comes to traveling overseas. But the majority of this video is just going to be talking about like what we did and what we saw while we were in the London area. Now to give you context, this trip has been in the works for years, like before I even started a YouTube channel. My wife and her friend are the ones that did all of this scheduling, and so I was just kind of there along for the ride, but I did try to cram in some gaming stuff when I could. Either way, it was definitely a family-oriented trip, but if you're planning on ever going over to the UK and London in particular, then you might find a couple tips and tricks that were pretty cool. Plus, we ate a lot of good food, and so I'll talk about that as well. Anyway, this is going to be probably a pretty low-key and fun little video, so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's start by talking about some of the things that I packed and why. And I just did a video about our trip to New York about 3 weeks ago when I checked out the ROG Ally X. And in that video, I specifically talked about like the backpack I brought and the bag that I use for all my cables and stuff. So I'm not going to go into detail about that. I'll leave the video link down below if you haven't seen it already. Instead, let's talk about the things that were different on this trip in particular. So let's talk about the devices that I brought. And this will be of no surprise to anyone who's been following this channel lately. I brought two of them, and one is the Odin 2 Mini. And the travel case that I used is from a company called Waterfield. It's actually made for Nintendo Switch Lite, but it's a perfect fit for the Odin 2 Mini. And I just finished a review video of this handheld if you want to check it out, but this thing really shines when it comes to traveling. It's really small and compact with excellent controls, but then also has a very bright screen, which is going to be very good if you're using, for example, public transit. So if you're on a train and you're going through like a bright environment, this thing will allow you to keep playing and it's still going to look great. In addition, because it's so small and it looks like a PS Vita, I found myself not being as self-conscious when I would like pull this out of my bag and play it in public, because it just looks like a gaming handheld that people would expect to see. And so when it comes to just traveling and having something small with you that is very powerful, the Odin 2 Mini is a really great match in that regard. I mostly used it to play Nintendo Switch games and other high-end emulation, for example with PlayStation 2, and all of it just works really well. This is a very powerful device. It's pretty expensive. It's like $340 starting price, but all the same, it is definitely worth it if you're looking for something powerful on the go. The other device I brought with me is the Anbernic RG Cube, and I'm actually still working on a review of this device. It'll come out after this video. So the case that I'm using for this is also from Waterfield. This is actually made for an analog pocket, but it's a really great fit for the Cube as well. Now, I've already done an impressions video about this device, and I am very excited about this one. It has a 1:1 aspect ratio square screen with a 720x720 resolution, and it's got a good amount of power to it. It's an Android-based device. It's got a lot of things going for it in terms of controls and just overall feel. I love how compact it is, but it's powerful enough to play through most Nintendo GameCube games, which is the primary system that I played with this device. Now, this wasn't my primary device when on travel. That was the Odin 2 Mini, but I kind of treated it like an emergency device. For example, if the Odin 2 ran out of battery, then I would use this, but then also this was my nighttime device. So right before going to sleep, laying in bed or whatever, I would play this little guy because it's so lightweight and compact. So I would knock out, just a few minutes of Paper Mario and Nintendo GameCube. It was a really great experience for that too. Anyway, I've got a lot to talk about with this handheld, and so be on the lookout for my next video, which will be a review for this device. I think that a lot of people are going to love it. Now let's talk about some of the special gear that I brought on this trip, and we'll start with this battery bank from Ugreen. Now, they send me a bunch of stuff all the time. I'm just like on their mailing list, and so I get all these things coming in the mail, and this battery pack is one of them. I'm actually very surprised it even made it to me because it takes a lot of like red tape in order to get things sent over in terms of batteries over to Hawaii. So kudos to them for actually figuring out how to do that. But yeah, I got this battery bank and it worked out really well. It has a 25,000 milliamp hour capacity, which is just a ton of space. Like that's enough to charge a Nintendo Switch like 4 times. It's crazy. And this battery bank was recently upgraded, so now it actually can output 140 watts in one of those USB-C ports, which was really good for me because I was using my laptop a lot. I was editing videos while like on the flights and whatnot. And so I was able to use this to charge my MacBook, which is pretty pretty crazy. Some of the things I really like about it is the fact that it shows your battery percentage in a number as opposed to like a bar so that you're guessing. And so I really like knowing exactly how much battery I had left. In addition, if you hold onto the power button for 3 seconds, it'll go into a trickle mode charging. And so I found that sometimes, plugging a device into this battery bank, it wouldn't charge it, like it wasn't giving it the right juice. But if I turned it on to trickle charge, especially for like older retro handhelds, it actually will charge them. And so I couldn't find a single device that wouldn't charge with this battery bank, which is kind of rare when it comes to these things. It also takes a 65-watt charging input, which means that it can charge in about 2 hours, which is pretty fast considering the capacity of this battery. It is expensive. I think it's like $85 when on sale, so you really have to know what you're getting into when it comes to these battery banks, but I am very happy with this one, and I've heard that it's going to be on sale during Prime Day, and so I will leave a link to that on Prime Day just to see how low it's going to actually be. Now, in addition to battery charging, another important factor when traveling from the US to the UK is actually being able to plug your stuff in. And so for this, I have a travel adapter. I'll leave a link down below. I've had this thing for a couple years at this point. It works really well. And it has adapters for just about everywhere, including Europe, UK, and Australia. And it's a very simple process to get it set up. You would just set it to the UK setting, plug this in, and then I would use my US adapter to plug into that. And again, this adapter was sent over from Ugreen. They just send me a bunch of stuff. This is their most updated one. I think it's 160 watts. It's crazy. And the nice thing about this setup is that the UK adapter also has USB outputs. In fact, it has 4 of them on the bottom. And so in combination with these two, I have 8 different USB ports to use, which is basically enough for my entire family. So we were able to charge our watches and our phones all at the same time. It worked out really well. Anyway, in terms of gear, that was my travel setup for this trip. Now, traveling from Hawaii to the UK kind of sucks. It is super far. It's like over 7,000 miles. And so as a result, you have to fly about 5 or 6 hours to California and then another 10 to 11 hours over to the UK from there. And so that's a lot of time in the air. And I used it pretty productively. I actually edited down a bunch of videos to upload by the time we got over to the UK. But then also, I obviously played some video games too, mostly the Odin 2 Mini. And then when the battery would deplete on that, then I would use my battery bank and charge it back up and then keep playing and vice versa. And that was where I played the majority of my games, just a few minutes here and there when we weren't doing something else related to the trip. There was one time where we took a day trip over to Stonehenge, and so we were like on a bus, and so that time I did actually bring my Odin 2 Mini with me. So I did take it out into the public space at one point, but for the most part I was, mostly just playing in the hotel room when we had some downtime. Now, like I mentioned in the intro, I was not in charge of this schedule for this trip, so we didn't do like a whole round trip going around and like checking out video game stores, but anytime I did see something, I would go and pop my head in and just see how it was. And so I did find that there was a chain of stores called CEX in the UK. And this feels kind of like a mix between Book Off in the fact that it's all used stuff, but then also a bit organized like a GameStop as well. And they do sell like hardware as well as games. Now, in terms of hardware, I'm not really sure if these prices were good, but I did find things like an analog pocket for sale, a Game Boy Advance, a couple Game Boys as well. These were on average, somewhere around like £100 UK, which is quite expensive. And so obviously I was not interested in buying any of this stuff. But it was cool to see, like UK box art and stuff with the Super Nintendo games that they had for sale. It was just kind of a unique experience. Now, when it came to some used games, I thought the prices weren't bad. For example, most PS2 games were usually like £1 or £2, so really like less than $5. They also had a lot of DS and 3DS games. These were a bit more expensive, usually around £5 each, but still not too bad in terms of pricing. I also found that the pricing for PS3 and Xbox 360 games wasn't half bad, especially compared to pricing here in Hawaii. Now, I didn't pick up any of these just because I wasn't sure if like region-wise I could use these on my systems, but it was nice to see that these were surprisingly affordable. And so yes, when it came to retro game shopping, we didn't have a lot of time to check this stuff out. As you'll see later in this video, we were super busy the entire time. But one thing I found super interesting is at the front of the shop, like actually facing the street, they had a couple highlighted items, including an original Odin Pro. And it was quite expensive. It was £240, which is about $300 US for a device that usually sells for, $199 on sale. And so I thought it was interesting though that they had a Chinese retro emulation device just right there in the storefront. They also had a Lenovo Legion Go. Again, the price was pretty high, £520, but it was pretty cool to see these devices that I've reviewed on this channel just available right here in the storefront. Okay, now let's actually start talking about all the things that we did and whatnot. And let me give you a little bit of context before we start with that. The first is that this was not my first trip to the UK. It was my third altogether, especially within London. The first time I went was about 20 years ago with my wife, back when we were dating. And so we went and we did all the touristy things back then when I was, in like my mid 20s. Now, flash forward to about 7 years ago, I also took another trip on my own over to the UK. I was in the middle of writing my third cookbook, which was all about like ancestry and heritage, and I'm of English descent. And so I went back to like my ancestral homes and looked at like where my ancestors came from. And so we spent some time in London on that trip, and then also went up to like Middle England where like my people are from. And so I've been to England a couple times, and so I was pretty familiar with just the entire country and just getting around. But this is the first time we were bringing our kids. And so this trip was really focused on showing them some of the real big highlights of England. So we did lots of very touristy things, but then things we also knew they would be very interested in, like a lot of Harry Potter stuff, which we'll talk about here later in the video. Now, in terms of weather, it was a nice experience. It's just the start of summer over there in the UK, and so temperatures were around maybe 55 to 60, so very much so jacket weather, especially for me in Hawaii, but it didn't rain that much, which was great. And so everything looked very nice. Everything was green, like the air felt very fresh, and we didn't get rained on too much. So that was pretty great. Now, because the weather was so good, we spent a lot of time walking. In fact, we averaged about 20,000 steps a day. So those are like, theme park numbers of steps. And so we were walking around a lot. We're just walking and walking and walking. But that was great because we also did a lot of eating. So it felt like it kind of balanced itself out. Now, because we spent most of our time in London proper, we had access to the subway. And so as a result, if we weren't going to be walking most of the time, we used the underground. And getting around in the underground is actually very fast and easy in the UK nowadays. In fact, all you really have to do is just open up Google Maps, say where you want to go, and then it'll tell you what public transport options you have. And so even though the subway map looks a little bit daunting, when you actually just use it with today's technology, it is a very simple experience. So just the same as it is in New York nowadays, same with Tokyo. And so all these cities are very easy to navigate nowadays, especially if you have a smartphone and you've got data. And of course, there are above ground trains as well as taxis and Uber. So there are many different ways to get around depending on where you want to go. Now, one interesting thing I found from this trip as opposed to the other ones I had gone on is that everything is very cashless in London right now. So I did not have a single pound of cash on me the entire time that we were on this trip. Everything was just tapping with my card. Subway, you tap with your card. You're going to buy some groceries or at a restaurant, you just tap with your card, or, if you have it hooked up with your phone. And so when it came to paying, everything was very seamless. I didn't have to worry about like conversions or cash, any of that kind of stuff. Everything was just using my card or my phone. So let's now start talking about some of the things that we saw. We're going to kind of go geographically. So I'm going to start at kind of the center of London, all the very touristy things within there, and then kind of work our way out to some of the things that are a little bit more off the beaten path. So this is not going to be in like chronological order, like day 1 through day 10, as opposed to just really kind of talking about things thematically. So let's start with probably one of the most important landmarks in the UK and in London, which is Buckingham Palace. And so this is the royal residence. This is where King Charles lives and the Queen before him. And so this is where you can see like the changing of the guard, stuff like that. Very popular and very touristy, but always great to just kind of show off, hey, this is where royalty lives. The kids really found that kind of cool. Another important landmark will be the Houses of Parliament as well as Big Ben. So super iconic. The kids really got a kick out of this. And I have to be honest, like it's been a while since I've seen Big Ben. This thing is massive and it's very majestic. And so even though it is very touristy to just kind of, cram into the crowd and take a look at it, it's still very impressive to see it in real life. Now, next to that is one of my favorite places in London. This is Westminster Abbey. So this is a church that's about 1,000 years old, and there are a ton of people who are either buried or memorialized here. It's really hard to tell who's buried and who's actually just got a plaque because they don't make it very clear. Now, you're not supposed to film within the church, so I don't have any footage of that, but there are some really impressive monuments there, including 18 different monarchs, and then a bunch of other figures from British history. And that includes Charles Darwin, Sir Isaac Newton, Stephen Hawking, but then also a ton of writers, including Charles Dickens, Rudyard Kipling, T.S. Eliot, and C.S. Lewis. And so it was pretty cool to see names that you would recognize within a bunch of others. There's like 3,000 memorials altogether, and so it's hard to see everyone, but it was pretty cool to recognize some names. Another historic and centralized area is going to be Tower of London. This has been around for about 1,000 years as well, around the time of the Norman Conquest. Now, this area has been used for many things throughout history, including a royal residence, but then also it was a prison for a long time and like some dungeons and stuff like that. A couple things it's probably most famous for are the ravens that you can find around here. There's just a ton of them. It's really impressive to see them walking around, but then also this is where the crown jewels are stored. And so this whole area is protected by those same royal guards. And again, you're not allowed to take any pictures or footage, so I don't have any of that, but yeah, still very impressive and definitely worth the visit. Now, another area that's just full of history is the central part of London along the River Thames. This is where the original London Bridge was. There is a bridge called London Bridge, but it's not the same as the one that, fell down all those years ago. But there's also one called Tower Bridge, which is very iconic. I think a lot of people recognize it from like the Spider-Man movie, things like that. And then there's also the London Eye. I had gone on this, like 20 years ago, but it's really expensive nowadays, so we didn't go on it. Either way, depending on the weather, this is a great place to walk around too. It just has a lot of history to it as well. And we did cross the river ourselves, but on the Millennium Bridge. This is a bridge that was used during filming of Harry Potter, and so it's pretty iconic just for many reasons. In fact, it actually goes directly to St. Paul's Cathedral, so it has some really nice views as you walk across it. And this dome cathedral is massive. It's actually one of the largest domes in the world, and it was the tallest building in London for years up until about maybe 50 years ago. And so this is definitely worth the visit as well. I think they filmed some of Harry Potter within this as well. I think it was like the stairway over to like the divinations class or something like that. And finally, the last historical thing I wanted to talk about is the Globe Theatre. So this is not the actual Globe Theatre from Shakespeare times. It's a recreation of it, but it's a working theater. So you can go inside, take a tour, have a look inside. And they actually built it to spec based on their estimations of what it looked like back in the day. Now, this is a working theater, so they still have productions going on all the time. And so even while we were doing our tour, they were like tearing down and setting up for the next night. And this is definitely a nice place to visit if you just want to get a feel for how things used to be back in Shakespeare times. Now, in addition to it being a recreation of the original Globe Theatre, it's also not the exact location. It's actually a few blocks away, but they do have a monument that shows where the original one was if you want to check that out as well. So that's a quick recap of all the more historical and touristy things that we did. So now let's move into the stuff that's a little bit more iconic in other ways. So we're going to start with Camden Town. Now, this area has always been associated with counterculture. So this is where the old punk rock and ska clubs back from the 70s and 80s used to be. And it's still a very vibrant and lively place. So a lot of fun just to kind of hang out, do a little bit of shopping, maybe eat a little bit. And if you know the bands that are playing, you can maybe catch a show. It's pretty awesome. And this is also where Amy Winehouse used to live. So there's a statue of her that you can visit. All just a very cool place to be. And so I really enjoyed this area. We also hit up Piccadilly Circus just for a minute. So this is kind of like the Times Square of London. There's lots of billboards and just a lot of traffic. And so if you want to hang out with a bunch of people, that's a place to be. But really, we just kind of stopped by for a photo op and then moved on to other places. So the next was Chinatown. And I do really like the Chinatown in London. It's a little bit small, but it's very different than the rest of London. So I like walking around here. We also went to a restaurant called Four Seasons. This place is known for its roast meats, things like duck and pork. So here we tried some char siu or roast pork, and then also some salted fish fried rice, as well as choy sum, which is a type of cabbage that's pretty popular in Chinese cuisine. And yeah, this was all really tasty, so I'd recommend checking this out if you happen to go down to Chinatown. And within walking distance of Chinatown is the West End. So that's where they have theater productions, things like that. Really cool area to hang out in. They've got some nice statues there as well. Now, in terms of shopping, we hit quite a few different places. Again, my wife and her friend made this whole schedule. And so one of the places we went to is Harrods. This is a really big and fancy department store in London. Now, they sell a lot of high fashion items here, which, as you can imagine, are super expensive. But they have a lot of actually surprisingly affordable food items there. And so I think that's probably one of the more popular reasons why people will go here. And we did go here to pick up omiyage, which is the Japanese word used here in Hawaii for souvenirs. And so, just a lot of nice food items there. Honestly, I spent most of my time looking at the charcuterie because they had a ton of awesome stuff there. But overall, yeah, just a really neat place to go and shop. We also hit a bunch of different markets. So I'm going to kind of cram these all together in one. The first is Borough Market. This one's actually pretty close to the Globe Theatre. This thing has been around forever. This market has been there since Shakespearean times. Now, this is an open air market, and one of my favorite things about it is that most of the items are very seasonal. So it's whatever is available right then and there at that time of the year. And it just so happened to be strawberry season, so we grabbed some of those, and you can get chocolate poured over it. It's very sweet, but also super tasty. And throughout the trip, we were also on the hunt to find some really good fish and chips. And so this is one of them that we found. It's a place called Fish Kitchen. And the fish that they have here really varies by day, depending on on what they were able to catch, and so they had rockfish while we were there. It was pretty good, kind of meaty, but also still pretty solid. And so I would say that, yeah, Borough Market was my favorite market that we visited among all of the others. Another one that we visited was in Notting Hill, and this is on Portobello Road. Now, I didn't know a lot about Portobello Road and the whole market other than, the song from Bedknobs and Broomsticks, but same thing here. This is a really old market. It's been around forever. And yeah, just a lot of different items available for sale. Another area is called Spitalfields. This one is a covered market, but again, just selling, your typical stuff in terms of like clothing as well as food. But there were a couple places that were recommended to us that we tried out. The first is a place called Chai Guy. So this is going to be selling, like hot tea or iced tea. And I found this to be really delicious. I enjoy a good chai latte here and there. And this is one of the best I'd ever had. Not too sweet, a little bit gingery, but yeah, just a nice like peppery finish to it. Another place that came recommended is called Sud Italia. So this is a Neapolitan pizza place. And it's really just a food truck, but they have something called Pizza Portafoglio. And essentially it's just a smaller pizza that they fold up, and it's only £5. So it's pretty cheap and yeah, really tasty. I'm typically gluten-free, but I did test this one out, and yeah, this is some good pizza. Now, if you want just a proper pizza, they sell that as well. It's £10, so about twice the price, but this was also very good. Now, we did hit up a couple other markets, but I'm going to push those to a different section when we talk about like movies and music. Instead, let's move over and talk about museums, because we hit up a couple of these as well. The nice thing about museums in London is that most of them are completely free. So you really just have to book it so that you schedule a time to go. But other than that, you can just kind of walk right in. It's pretty great. Probably the most iconic museum in London is the British Museum. Now, this place I have a bit of a love and hate relationship with. They have a ton of cool stuff from back in the day, but a lot of these were acquired during the times of like the British Empire. And so, depending on who you talk to, they kind of like stole this stuff and then put it in a museum. And so I always feel like this kind of mixed feeling, in that it's really awesome to see these pieces of history, but then also I often will think, man, this probably belongs in the original country as well. Anyway, some of the highlights here include the Rosetta Stone, which, me as a former translator and linguist, this is always super cool to see. And I saw this last time I visited Britain as well. They've also got a ton of different like Greek and Roman and Middle Eastern artifacts. Some of these things will really transport you to back in those older times. I will say that if you are going to go to this museum, you should probably dedicate a whole day to it, because it is exhausting and overwhelming. Just the amount of things that you can see here, and just, reading each placard is going to take you all day. But if you're into ancient history, especially like ancient Egypt, they've got a ton of very unique pieces here. Now, another museum we visited is the Tate Modern. I'm not a huge fan of modern art, but my wife loves it. And so we often will go to these kind of museums. And there are some really interesting pieces here. And the building itself is actually really cool looking too. Again, this museum is totally free. And so if you are interested in checking some of this stuff out, there is some pretty impressive and famous pieces here as well. And then finally, the last museum we hit up is the Natural History Museum. This one is always impressive to go to. I also went to this one about 20 years ago as well. One of my favorite things about it is one of these central rooms that has a huge blue whale and then a bunch of other skeletons around it. It gives you an idea of just the scale of the blue whale, which, by the way, is like the largest animal that's probably ever existed, including prehistory. And so it's just super awesome to see this huge, massive animal, and then just kind of how it compares to these other things that we also consider to be very large or very small. And they also have an impressive collection of dinosaur fossils. I always find it funny because I associate fossils with like the United States, like Montana and Wyoming, but there were a ton in Europe as well. Mostly during the 1800s, they discovered a bunch. And so most of those are going to be what's in this collection here. Also within this section, I did want to mention that we went to the London Zoo, and this was kind of a mixed bag experience because the zoo itself is big and they've got a lot of space for the animals, which I think is great. But because it was so chilly, most of the animals did not come outside at all. And so half the animals that we wanted to see, you just couldn't see at all. And so among all of the places that we visited, this one was probably the biggest letdown for the kids in particular, because, they wanted to see like the 7 or 8 gorillas they have, but we ended up not seeing any of them at all. Okay, now let's talk about some of the places that we visited within the London area that required a little bit of travel. And so for this first section, we actually went on a day trip. We paid for a tour and we went to 3 different sites. And the first one was Windsor Castle. And this is the oldest castle that is still an active resident by a monarch. And so the Queen back in the day used to actually travel here on the weekends, and the King also will go here from time to time. Now, much like with some of the other things that we saw within London, we weren't allowed to take pictures or do any footage within the castle walls, but there are a ton of different paintings and pieces of art, just mostly, portraits of all the old monarchs, but it's really impressive. Unfortunately, I just don't have any footage. Either way, if you're into like the royals, like the Queen show and all that stuff, then this is going to be really interesting. I'm not too much into that stuff, but it was still kind of cool to see it from a historical perspective. I don't know if I mentioned it before, but my undergraduate degree is in history or social studies, and so I'm just really into historical stuff, so this was pretty cool from that perspective for me. Also on this trip, we went over to Stonehenge, which is on the western side. It's in Salisbury. And so I've been here as well, but the kids really enjoyed this. This is a really kind of interesting place and very different from London itself. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere. And these monuments have been around for like 3,000 years. It's kind of crazy. Now, it's always a big mystery about Stonehenge, like how these things got here and why they were put there in the first place. But it's still just very impressive to see that, 3,000 years ago, people hauled these huge rocks into these big like flatlands and then put them here. I always love looking at ancient ruins like this because I feel like it connects us to our older versions of humanity. And so I've always found that really cool. And then finally, the third place we went on this same trip, it was a long day. We went to Oxford. And so we checked out Oxford University. Now, the main reason why we were interested in going to Oxford, again, my wife and her friend had kind of scheduled all this stuff. They knew that a bunch of things had been filmed from the Harry Potter movies here. But unfortunately, due to the time of the year, most of the people were having like graduation parties and stuff. So the universities were shut. And so we were not able to actually see a lot of the things that we wanted to see, at least from like a Harry Potter filmmaking perspective. But the town itself is super cool. There's all these different colleges that make up the university right there, and everything just looks very iconic. It also reminds me a lot of the books from Philip Pullman, the His Dark Materials, like Golden Compass and whatnot. They were set in Oxford, but in an alternate version of Oxford. And so it was just kind of cool walking around those streets and thinking about that series. One of my favorite book trilogies. Now let's move into the more exciting things. So let's talk about like the things that are associated with like movies and TV shows. All of us that were going on this trip love movies and TV, and my wife and her friend in particular really set up specific things that we were going to do based on some of their favorite movies and stuff. And so the first thing we did is we went on a Warner Brothers studio tour for the original Harry Potter movies. This does take a little bit of travel to get to, about an hour of traveling between train and bus, but this is actually a really impressive place. They took all of these sets from the original movies and then put them all in one single warehouse. So you kind of walk around and see all of the things that they filmed from back in those movies. Now, I would say among everybody in the trip, it was our kids who were most excited about this tour because they just kind of grew up with Harry Potter, both the movies as well as the books. They still like listen to the audiobooks when they have spare time. They've all read through the series. Even my 8-year-old knows everything back and forth. And I personally got a kick out of it as well, just because I love the filmmaking process and the idea of seeing things behind the scenes. And so it was cool to see like Dumbledore's office and Hagrid's hut, as well as like the potions class. Like these are things that you see in film, but then when you see them in real life as well, it's like, oh man, it's like a little bit more magical. And so I really enjoyed that. Anyway, this is definitely a full day experience. And so definitely plan, if you are going to be going to this, to spend the entire day there, because they've even got a restaurant in the middle of everything. So that way, when you're halfway done, you can like take a break, have some butter beer, maybe grab a hot dog or whatever. And so, yeah, just a lot of things to see and do here within the studio tour. We've done other studio tours before, for example, in Los Angeles. This one was way better than that. Now, much like with the British Museum, I was a little bit torn and had some mixed feelings about this part of the tour, just because, like I'm not a huge fan of the author and some of the inflammatory things that she's been saying over the years. But the franchise itself and the work that she created in terms of the novels as well as the movies afterwards, like they are very impressive and they are very significant to my children. And so that's why we went on this tour. We really enjoyed it. And I understand why some people may not be interested in going on something like this. But if you are a Harry Potter fan, then I think you would really like it. Okay, some other things we did related to the Harry Potter series is we went over to Leadenhall Market. So this is where they filmed, like, I think the Leaky Cauldron in the first Harry Potter movie. And so really kind of cool, iconic area. There's actually a Mario Kart 8 level that goes through this market. And so it's really iconic. And, like things like the most recent Wonka movie were inspired by this market as well. And so just really kind of cool to walk through this place, which is also very old. I think something like 500 years old. It's pretty crazy. Now, our hotel was also near King's Cross. It was actually within walking distance. And so we were able to go here, just to jump on the tube here and there. But then also this is where platform 9 3/4 is. And actually, if you go over by where those platforms are, they actually have like a trolley that's been halfway put into the brick. I remember this actually from like 20 years ago. This place used to have like nobody there, and we took some pictures here. Nowadays, it's like super crowded. They even have like a platform 9 3/4 store right next to it. We also visited the place where they filmed the outside of Grimwald Place. Now, this is just like a typical like London apartment building, but it had some significance, at least in terms of the movies. In fact, in one of the windows, they had a little creature statue. So if you zoomed in, you can actually see him, and I thought that was pretty neat. Anyway, that's a quick recap of some of the things that we did related to Harry Potter. So let's move on to the next main franchise that my wife was really interested in, and that was Ted Lasso. Now, Richmond is a borough on the west side of London, and so you can just go and visit. It doesn't take long to get there. And they did film some pretty iconic moments, at least the outdoor scenes here in this area. Now, Richmond itself doesn't have a football club like you can see in the TV show, but still, they've really kind of pumped up the whole Ted Lasso thing within this town. In fact, on the left, you can see the bar that they film at least the outside scenes of like May's pub. Now, the inside was filmed somewhere else, but it is pretty similar if you actually look at it. And we did also stop there for lunch, and so it was Sunday as well, so I had a traditional Sunday roast. And in this case, it included, some sirloin beef and some root vegetables, as well as some spring veg, and then also a Yorkshire pudding. And of course, like with everywhere else, we had to try out the fish and chips. These were pretty good here too. Now, further in the town, there's another scene that's pretty iconic from the Ted Lasso series. It's basically when Roy Kent and Keeley have their first date, and there's like a confrontation with a paparazzi. All that stuff was filmed outside here too as well. And so my wife in particular thought this was pretty cool. She basically wishes that I was Roy Kent, and so she really got a kick out of this area. And that's really about it when it came to Ted Lasso. Another thing that we did related to movies is when we were in Notting Hill, we went over to some of those iconic areas. Now, I haven't seen this movie in so long, I think since like the theaters, but I do remember there was like a bookshop, and so that's there, although it's really just a gift shop now. And then also, I think it's the building where Hugh Grant lived. It has like the blue door. That was there as well, so we took some footage of that too. Either way, obviously, I didn't put this one on the schedule, but it was somewhere that we visited. Now, one place I did definitely want to go to was Abbey Road. Again, I had been to this place, like 20 years ago, but my kids are huge Beatles fans, and so it was really cool to just take all four of us over there and, like walk across the crosswalk, all those things that you would do. And so it was just really kind of cool to have that moment there. Now, this is a super busy area, so definitely keep your eye out when you're crossing the street here. But man, Beatles are like one of the formative bands for me. So it was really cool to just be able to walk in the same place that at least those guys had also stepped. And the Abbey Road Studios is right there as well. And this is a working studio. They still are recording music out of here. There's a huge wall right in front of it too that you can draw on. And I definitely had to leave my mark here. And so I decided to write, "I am the wall, Russ." And I thought that was a pretty good dad joke right there. And so that's a recap of the things that we did related to like music and movies and whatnot. And the last thing I just wanted to talk about really quickly are just some food observations I had. I'm a big foodie, I wrote like 3 cookbooks. And so I always like, checking out the local cuisine and making some observations. Now, first observation is that this place is just full of bread. I've been gluten-free for, I don't know, almost 15 years at this point. It's crazy. But yeah, everything is just like wrapped in bread. They've got all those like pasties or hand pies and stuff. And so it's very hard to get a good solid meal without also eating some bread at the same time. For the most part in the mornings, we would go to a cafe or bakery, mostly Italian or French. And there, everyone would get like some coffee, the kids would get like hot chocolate. And then also, everyone else would get like bread, but then I would order a traditional English breakfast. And so I don't know how many of these plates I ate, but it's all usually the same thing. So it's going to be some sausage and some like baked beans, but then also like grilled mushrooms, grilled tomatoes, and an egg and some bacon. So this was typically like my breakfast meal, and considering the fact that we were walking like 20,000 steps a day, I definitely needed those calories, so this was really hitting the spot. Now, depending on when we ate breakfast and how big it was, sometimes we would have a small lunch or a bigger lunch. Often we would go to a pub. And so here we could get things like fish and chips or bangers and mash, which is just like sausage and potatoes, all very like brown and kind of bland foods, but very hearty and filling. It also gave me an opportunity to try out a bunch of different ciders, which are really big in England, including like the traditional flat ones, but then the more modern ones as well. And so I enjoy hard ciders. This is one of my highlights as well. And the last thing I wanted to talk about when it came to food are kebab shops. Now, these are all over in Europe, but the thing that I noticed specifically in this trip to England is that many of these places were influenced by German cuisine. And you might be thinking, Where's the connection there? And so let me kind of peel back the layers on that. First, if you don't know what a kebab is, this is basically a meat wrap. So like a gyro or a shawarma, depending on where you are in the world. And the idea is, you know, you have like that cone of meat and you shave it and you put it inside like a bread wrap, and then you have like vegetables and whatnot. So that's essentially what a kebab is. Now, the whole German thing has to do with immigration from Turkey. And so in the 80s and 90s, a bunch of Turkish immigrants arrived in Germany and they opened up doner kebab shops. And so these are, you know, these meat wrap shops. And so they became like a late night staple in Germany. I remember seeing them all over the place when I was traveling there, you know, back in the day. And so this is one of those things where it got really deep into like German culture to the point where these mixtures of cuisine started to happen. So for example, red cabbage, which is like a staple of traditional German fare. This is like a little bit sweet and kind of pickled. And so this started getting added to those doner kebabs. And so it had like a little bit of a tangy taste to it. And so I saw that cabbage also in England, which I thought was really interesting. And in addition, there's like franchises now of kebab shops, like one called GDK, German Doner Kebab. And that's where that comes from. And so I thought that was really interesting. In addition, you know, some of these places, instead of having like a traditional Middle Eastern, like Mediterranean style, like flatbread, they were using like waffle bread instead. Again, very European. And so I thought this was really kind of cool to see the mixture between like European cuisine and Middle Eastern or Mediterranean cuisine together into like this one like cheap kind of late night dish. Now, nowadays, you can actually just order these things like directly on like a tablet, like kind of like when you go to McDonald's nowadays. And so I thought that was kind of cool. And you don't have to get it in a wrap, again, you know, gluten-free. And so you can actually just get a bowl of this. And I thought that was pretty cool. And so I don't have a lot of footage about this food, but if you are going to be in the area and you want to try out one of these doner kebabs, I think it is pretty cool, just the mixture of cultures there. Anyway, I think that's really going to wrap it up in terms of the food and really this video in particular. And so I know we spent a lot of time talking about like London and things to do and whatnot, not a lot of time talking about video games, but I thought, you know, if you're ever going to be traveling to this area and you want to see, you know, what your options are, I'm hoping that this will be a little bit helpful. Anyway, that's really about it for this video. I hope you enjoyed, you know, just hearing about this trip to London. And, you know, one of the benefits of me being retired from the military is that I'm no longer tethered down by like my work or whatever. It's really just a matter of making these videos. And so I can kind of do that wherever. And so I've really enjoyed this aspect of my life, but let me know what you think about these travel videos in particular. I've got a couple trips coming up and I'm not sure if I'm going to make videos about them. For example, in a couple weeks, I'll be going to Philadelphia for Too Many Games. There's just like a fest or a con, and the whole Nerd Nest podcast crew is going to be there. We're going to do a live taping of our actual podcast show. We're going to have Bob Wolf as our special guest. We'll talk about handhelds and stuff. So if you're in the East Coast area and you want to come like meet me and whatnot, you can totally do that. I'll leave all the specifics down below. It's pretty cheap to go. I think it's like $90 for the whole weekend. So if you're in the area, yeah, come and say hi. Now, other than that, later on in the year, I'm going to be going to Germany. We're doing this with my wife. And so it's like a kind of a private trip, but then also I'm going to be doing some gaming related things as well. So let me know if you'd like to see a video about either of these two things. And I hope you enjoyed this one, you know, just talking about London and things that we did and saw and ate and whatnot. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.